The city never slept, and neither did he. For 5 years now, Xiong had stared into the dark, lying perfectly still in a bed that never seemed to welcome him, waiting for rest that refused to come. Night after night passed the same way, his eyes open, his mind sharp, his body exhausted beyond reason. Doctors had told him nothing was wrong. Tests came back clean. Charts looked fine. They offered suggestions, theories, reassurances. Zion knew better. They were wrong about a lot of things. Control had given him everything: money, influence, power, a reputation for brilliance, but it had failed him here. Sleep laughed at control, mocked it. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse. Atlanta spread out below him in a glittering grid of lights and movement. Traffic still pulsed. Buildings still glowed. Somewhere down there, people were finishing late shifts, starting early mornings, living lives that included rest. Zion rested his palm against the cool glass and exhaled slowly. 5 years. The insomnia had started after his company went public. The moment the world decided he was a success was the same moment the nights turned merciless. Success was supposed to feel like a rival. Instead, it had brought a crushing awareness of how alone he truly was. Every night, he lay in a king-sized bed, dressed in sheets that cost more than most people's rent. Surrounded by silence so thick it felt physical. And still nothing. No rest, no peace. Only the constant grinding awareness of his own exhaustion. Suggested explanations had come and gone. One specialist had mentioned stress. Another had floated the idea that it was psychological. Zion dismissed that immediately. He didn't have time for psychology. He had a company to run, investors to reassure, competitors to outrun. His calendar was mapped in 15-minute increments. His diet was measured, optimized, refined. His emotions controlled through discipline and habit. Control had always been his greatest strength. Except sleep refused to obey. He turned away from the window and moved through the penthouse. The soft lights illuminating a space designed for solitude and focus. Clean lines, neutral tones, everything intentional, everything perfect. Once, this place had felt like a reward. Now it felt like a prison he'd built for himself. His phone sat on the marble kitchen counter, screen dark. He had been staring at it for nearly an hour, weighing a decision that terrified him more than any hostile takeover or billion-dollar risk ever had. Business decisions didn't scare him. He understood numbers, patterns, leverage. This was different. The truth sat heavy in his chest. Simple and humiliating in a way no financial failure had ever been. Zion was 38 years old and a virgin. Not because of religion. Not because he lacked opportunity. Not because he didn't feel desire. He was a virgin because intimacy demanded something he had never learned how to give: vulnerability, trust, the willingness to be fully seen by another person. He had learned early that emotion was dangerous. His mother, a high-powered corporate attorney, had raised him with the same sharp efficiency she brought to boardrooms and negotiations. Affection was earned, not offered freely. Praise came only after achievement. Love felt conditional long before he had language for it. His father had been worse, an investment banker who measured everything by return, including his own child. By 10, Zion understood that love was transactional. By 15, he stopped expecting it. By 20, he had built walls so high no one could climb them. And by 38, he had forgotten why those walls existed at all. Still, they remained. The exhaustion had become part of him. His assistant noticed. His executive team noticed. Even the cleaning service had once left a polite note suggesting he looked tired. Zion ignored it all and pushed forward. Because that was who he was, a man who solved problems through sheer force of will, except this problem would not be solved. 3 months earlier, during a particularly brutal stretch of sleepless nights, he had found himself researching companionship services. Not the obvious seedy corners of the internet, but legitimate, discreet agencies that advertised connection without complication, professional companionship, boundaries, clarity. He had bookmarked the site, closed it, reopened it, repeated the cycle dozens of times until tonight. Tonight felt different. The exhaustion had crossed a threshold. Pretending he was fine no longer worked. Zion stood at the counter, hands braced against the cool stone, and finally admitted something he had never allowed himself to say out loud. He needed help, not the kind doctors could give him. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened his laptop and navigated back to the site. The interface was clean, understated, professional. Photos of men and women filled the screen, attractive but real. Each profile included a short description. Specialties, personality traits. 1. Stopped him. Naomi Pierce, 32, former social worker, empathetic, intelligent, comfortable with clients seeking emotional connection. Rather than physical services, her photo showed a woman with warm brown eyes, natural hair pulled back loosely, and a smile that didn't feel practiced. It reached her eyes. Zion read her profile once. Then again. Then a third time. Something in his chest tightened, not fear, exactly, but recognition. He filled out the request form slowly, honestly, in a way that made his skin prickle with discomfort. He wrote about the insomnia, the isolation, the fact that he had never been intimate with anyone and didn't even know what he was asking for. He didn't dress it up, didn't hide behind polished language. When he finally clicked submit, there was no taking it back. At exactly 3:41 a.m., the confirmation screen appeared. Zion closed the laptop and stood there in the quiet penthouse, heart pounding, wondering what he had just set in motion. The response came faster than Zion expected. He had barely finished replaying the decision in his mind, questioning it, regretting it, telling himself he could still cancel when an email notification appeared on his phone. He stared at it for several seconds before opening it. His pulse steady, but heavy. Like something inside him had already begun to shift. Naomi Pierce was available. She had read his request, all of it, and she was willing to meet. The agency's message was professional and concise, outlining the terms clearly: respect, boundaries, consent. The right for either party to end the arrangement at any time, no questions asked. An appointment could be arranged for the following evening if he agreed. Zion read the email twice, then a third time. His instinct was to analyze it the way he analyzed contract searching for hidden risks, unintended consequences, leverage points, but there were none. Just clarity. He agreed to everything. He submitted payment information, provided his address, confirmed the time. 7 o'clock sharp. When the final confirmation appeared, a strange stillness settled over him. The decision was no longer theoretical. It was real, scheduled, inevitable. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling, unsure whether he felt relief or panic. Probably both. The rest of the day passed in a blur he barely remembered. Meetings stacked on top of meetings. Quarterly projections. Legal briefings. A potential acquisition his lawyers seemed excited about. Zion nodded at the right moments, signed what needed signing, spoke when expected, but his mind kept drifting back to the same thought. Tomorrow evening by late afternoon, his anxiety had climbed 2 levels he usually associated with high-stakes negotiations. He left the office earlier than usual and went straight home. He showered once. Then again. Changed clothes. Changed them again. He straightened furniture that was already perfectly arranged. Adjusted lighting. Checked the guest towels. Checked them again, when the doorman called to announce a visitor just before 7. Zion's heart slammed so hard, he genuinely wondered if something was wrong with him. He stood frozen for a moment, then forced himself to breathe. The private elevator opened exactly at 7. Naomi stepped out. She wasn't what he expected, though he wasn't sure what he had expected. There was no dramatic entrance, no calculated sensuality. She wore dark jeans, a cream-colored sweater, and carried a small leather bag over one shoulder. Her hair was pulled back casually. She looked like someone you might pass in a coffee shop or see browsing a bookstore. Ordinary, grounded, and somehow exactly right. Zion. Her voice was warm, steady, unforced. "Yes," he said, stepping aside. "Please." Come in. As she walked past him into the living space, Zion became acutely aware of how sterile his home must feel. Naomi didn't comment on the view or the furnishings. She simply took it all in quietly, without judgment. Then turned to face him. "Thank you for being honest in your request," she said. "I appreciate knowing what you actually need rather than what you think you should want." Every response Zion had rehearsed evaporated. This wasn't how he imagined the conversation starting. This woman wasn't treating him like a transaction, she was treating him like a person. "I don't actually know what I need," he admitted. Naomi smiled softly. "That's okay. We have time to figure it out." She moved further into the room with an ease that unsettled him, not invasive, just natural, not like someone hired to be there, like someone invited. The distinction mattered more than he could explain. "Would you like something to drink?" he asked, grateful for something familiar to do. "Water would be nice. Thank you." As he filled 2 glasses in the kitchen, he watched her from the corner of his eye. She had moved toward the windows, studying the city lights below with genuine curiosity. "You can see the whole financial district from here," she said as he handed her the glass. "Yes," he replied. "I chose this building for the view." He paused. "Though I rarely actually look at it anymore." "That happens," she said easily. "We stop seeing the things we live with every day." She turned to face him fully, her expression open but focused. "Your message mentioned insomnia. How long has it been since you slept through the night?" The directness caught him off guard. Most people circled difficult topics. Naomi stepped straight into them. 5 years, he said, after a moment. "Maybe longer. It became severe around then." "That must be exhausting." The simplicity of the statement tightened something in his chest. No solutions. No judgment. Just acknowledgement. "It is," he said quietly. She gestured toward the large sectional sofa. "Can we sit? Standing feels too formal for this." They sat at opposite ends, leaving space between them that felt safer than closeness. Naomi didn't rush to fill it. "I read that you've never been intimate with anyone," she said calmly. "Can I ask why you decided to reach out now?" Zion had anticipated the question and still struggled to answer. "I thought, maybe the insomnia is connected, that if I experienced what I've been avoiding, something might change." "And what have you been avoiding?" she asked, gently. "Physical intimacy. Or emotional intimacy?" He hesitated. "I don't know the difference." Her expression softened. "That's honest. Most people pretend they do. You sound like a therapist." "I was a social worker for 8 years," she said. "I worked mostly with trauma survivors, people who forgot how to trust." She paused. "You remind me of some of them." "I haven't experienced trauma," Zion said automatically. "Trauma isn't only what happens to us," Naomi replied. "Sometimes it's what never did. Affection, safety, being seen." He looked away. "This was a mistake," he said suddenly. "I shouldn't have contacted the agency." "Why?" "Because I thought I could approach this like a business transaction." Clearly, that was naive. "It is a transaction," Naomi said evenly. "But that doesn't mean it can't also be real." Something in her certainty made him look back at her. "Really? Look, I'm afraid," he admitted, "of being seen. Of someone realizing how broken I am." Naomi held his gaze. "You're not broken, Zion. You're defended. There's a difference." The tension in his shoulders eased just slightly enough to notice Dot, and for the first time that evening, he didn't feel like running. Something shifted in the room after Naomi said it. "You're not broken. You're defended." The words lingered between them, not dramatic or heavy-handed, just steady and certain. Zion didn't know why they affected him the way they did, only that his body responded before his mind could argue. His shoulders lowered a fraction. His breathing slowed. They sat there for a moment. The space between them still intact, but no longer sharp with tension. They talked for a while about things that felt safer at first. Naomi asked about his company, not in the polished, performative way people usually did, but with genuine curiosity. Zion found himself explaining his work with an enthusiasm he hadn't felt in months. He talked about building something from nothing, about the thrill of solving problems no one else could see yet. As he spoke, he realized how rare it was for someone to listen without trying to extract something from him. Naomi shared her own story in return. How she had spent years as a social worker, working with people in crisis. People whose lives had fractured quietly and completely. How she eventually burned out under the weight of it. Feeling like she was expected to carry everyone else's pain while ignoring her own. Transitioning into companionship work hadn't been an escape so much as a recalibration. It allowed her to choose her clients, to set boundaries, to stay human. People think intimacy is just physical, she said at one point. But I've sat with men who needed to cry more than they needed to touch. I've listened to women talk about marriages where they were never actually seen. The body is easy. It's the heart most people can't reach. Zion absorbed that quietly. Do you think that's what I need? He asked. To access my heart. Naomi smiled, not indulgent, not knowing. I think you need to remember you have one. The conversation deepened without either of them noticing exactly when it happened. Time loosened. Zion felt something unfamiliar settle into his chestnut excitement. Not fear, comfort. Not the false comfort of control or achievement. But the ease of existing alongside another person, without expectation. Naomi didn't try to fix him. Didn't ask him to change. She simply stayed present, around 10 o'clock. She stood and stretched lightly, rolling her shoulders as if grounding herself. Can I ask you something that might sound strange? Yes, he said immediately. Would you mind if we just lay down? She asked. Not for anything physical. Just to rest. Sometimes our bodies need permission to relax, and they respond better when we're not alone. Zion's first instinct was refusal. The idea of lying down beside someone of being horizontal, unguarded sent a ripple of panic through him. That position stripped away control. But his exhaustion pressed heavier than his fear. Okay, he said finally. They moved to the bedroom. Naomi entered without comment, without the subtle appraisal he was used to. The massive bed dominated the space, perpetually made untouched more often than not. He realized, with a strange ache, that it had been years since anyone else had stood in this room. Do you have a side you prefer? Naomi asked. No, he admitted. I move too much. Nothing ever feels right. Then I'll take this one, she said, choosing the side closer to the windows. She kept her clothes on, slipping off only her shoes before lying down on top of the covers. Zion mirrored her on the opposite side. They lay several feet apart, staring up at the ceiling. This feels absurd, he said quietly. Most meaningful things do at first, she replied. Silence, settled not, awkward, just present. Outside, the city hummed with endless energy. Inside, two people lay in the dark, strangers connected by honesty and need. Can I tell you something? Naomi asked softly. Yes. I almost cancelled tonight, she admitted. I read your message and thought you needed more than I could offer. That you might need therapy, not companionship. She paused. But something about your honesty made me want to show up. To see if maybe just being present would be enough. Why do you do this work? Zion asked. You don't need to. I do, she said. Just not financially. She turned her head slightly toward him, though the darkness hid most of her face. After my divorce, I felt invisible, like I had spent years being what someone else needed, and forgotten who I was. This work lets me choose. Every client is a choice. Every boundary is mine. That matters. Were you married long? 8 years. There was sadness in her voice, but no bitterness. He wasn't a bad man. We were just wrong for each other. He wanted someone who would disappear into his life. I needed to be seen as separate. Zion considered that. I've never even had a relationship, he said. I wouldn't know how to be wrong for someone. I've never let anyone close enough. That must be lonely. It is, he admitted. The word came easier than he expected. Lonely felt safer than the alternative. But now, I'm so tired that safe doesn't feel worth it anymore. They talked quietly for another hour about childhood, family, the unspoken lessons they had absorbed about love and worth. Naomi shared stories from her work, some tender, some devastating. Zion found himself recounting memories he hadn't visited in decades. His mother's efficiency, his father's distance. The private schools where achievement mattered more than happiness. I learned early that feelings were inconvenient, he said. So I stopped having them, or I thought I did. They don't stay buried forever, Naomi said. No, he murmured. They come back as insomnia and loneliness. She laughed softly. At least you recognize it. That's more than most people ever do. Sometime near midnight, Zion noticed something unfamiliar happening in his body. The tension that lived permanently in his jaw loosened. His shoulders softened against the mattress. Naomi's breathing beside him grew slow and steady, and without effort. His own breath began to match hers. Naomi, he said quietly. Yes. Thank you for being here. You're welcome. The silence that followed felt almost peaceful. His thoughts slowed. The ceiling blurred. For the first time in years, his mind stopped racing. He didn't realize he was falling asleep. The transition was so gentle, so natural, that he simply drifted without resistance. Without fear. For the first time in 5 years, Naomi noticed it before. Zion did. The change was subtle, at first a shift in his breathing. The way the tension finally released from his face. Years of defense unwound quietly in the dark. His chest rose and fell in a slow, even rhythm, no longer sharp or guarded. He had crossed the threshold without realizing it. He was asleep. Naomi turned her head toward him, studying his profile in the faint glow of city light filtering through the windows. His features had softened completely. The tight lines around his eyes, set there by years of sleepless nights and constant vigilance, had smoothed. He looked younger, more open, vulnerable, in a way that felt almost sacred. She hadn't expected this. In her years doing this work, Naomi had witnessed many outcomes. Some clients wanted distraction, some wanted validation, some wanted to feel powerful, others wanted to feel wanted. But watching a man who had spent years locked inside himself finally surrendered to rest, finally allow his body to believe it was safe, different, deeper, more intimate than anything physical could have been, she stayed still, careful not to disturb him. Outside, the city continued its restless motion. Inside, time felt suspended. Naomi lay awake, listening to his breathing, aware of the weight of the moment. This wasn't seduction. This wasn't performance. This was trust, offered unconsciously, without negotiation. She understood then that her role tonight had nothing to do with desire. She was a witness. Minutes stretched into an hour. Naomi's thoughts drifted not to herself, but to him, to the defended boy he must have once been, to the man who had learned to survive by shutting down parts of himself until only control remained. She felt the quiet responsibility of having been allowed into that private space, even temporarily. Around 2 a.m, exhaustion finally claimed her too. She closed her eyes gently, letting sleep come without urgency, without expectation. This wasn't just another appointment. She could feel that clearly. This mattered. Zion slept through the night, the entire night, for the first time in 5 years. His body didn't jolt awake in panic or cycle endlessly through fractured half-dreams. He didn't wake to check the clock. He didn't fight his thoughts. He rested fully, his system finally standing down from a war it had been fighting alone. Morning arrived softly. Sunlight spilled across the bedroom, warm and unintrusive. Zion stirred, disoriented at first. Light meant morning. Morning meant time had passed. Too much time. His eyes opened fully, and confusion gave way to something else, wonder. He had slept. He turned his head slowly. Naomi was still there, sitting up against the headboard with her phone in her hands. She looked over as she sensed his movement. "Good morning," she said quietly. Zion pushed himself upright too quickly, his heart racing not with panic, but disbelief. "What time is it?" "Almost 8, he stared at her. "I slept," she smiled, soft and certain. "You did deeply." "I slept through the night," he repeated, the words barely holding together. 5 years of exhaustion collapsed under the weight of that realization. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to ground himself. His body felt different, lighter, rested in a way he barely remembered. How? He asked. Sometimes our bodies just need to feel safe, Naomi said, setting her phone aside. You've been in survival mode for a long time. Last night, you finally let your guard down. Zion looked at her, then really looked at her, in the clear morning light. She hadn't left. She had stayed, even though she didn't have to. She had witnessed his most unguarded state, and remained. I should pay you more, he said awkwardly. You stayed longer than expected. Her expression shifted immediately. She stood and walked to where her bag rested near the bedroom door. When she returned, she was holding an envelope. He recognized it instantly. I can't accept this, Naomi said, holding it out to him. I don't understand. Last night wasn't work, she said gently but firmly. It became something else. I stayed because I wanted to. Because watching you finally find peace felt like a privilege, not a service. Taking money for that would cheapen what actually happened. Zion stared at the envelope, unmoving. That doesn't make sense. We had an agreement. We did, Naomi replied, and I'm choosing to change it. She set the envelope on the nightstand between them. What happened here matters more than the transaction. You don't even know me, he said. I know you trusted me enough to fall asleep, she answered. I know you told me things you've never said out loud before. I know you're terrified of connection and brave enough to try anyway. She sat back down on the edge of the bed. That's more than I know about most people I've dated for months. Something cracked open in Zion's chest, not painfully, quietly. I want to see you again, he said, before he could stop himself. Not as a client. Whatever this is. Naomi was silent for a moment, weighing the words. Then, she smiled faintly. That's complicated. Everything about me is complicated, he said. She laughed softly. Fair point. Her expression grew serious. If we do this, it has to be real. Not a transaction pretending to be a relationship. I don't know how to do real, Zion admitted. Neither do I, she said honestly. But maybe we could learn. Hope rose in him, terrifying, unfamiliar, undeniable. Okay, he said. Let's try. They exchanged phone numbers like teenagers, both slightly awkward, both pretending not to feel how momentous the gesture was. Naomi left around 9, pausing at the elevator. Don't overthink this, she told him. Just see what happens. After she left, Zion stood alone in the penthouse. Everything unchanged and nothing the same. He had slept, he had let someone stay, and for the first time in years, the night no longer felt like an enemy. The weeks that followed felt unreal to Zion, as if his life had tilted slightly off its familiar axis and hadn't settled back into place yet. He and Naomi began seeing each other regularly, but not at his penthouse. That space still felt too exposed, too tied to who he had been before that night. Instead, they met in neutral places, coffee shops where they could sit for hours talking while the noise of other lives moved around them, museums where they walked slowly through galleries, pausing more for conversation than art, a small bookstore Naomi loved, tucked into a quiet street, where she drifted between shelves with an ease that made Zion realize how little time he had ever spent simply wandering. With each meeting, Zion learned more about her. She volunteered at a women's shelter on weekends, refusing to talk about it as if it were anything special. She was trying to write a novel but kept deleting her drafts, convinced none of them were good enough. She loved thunderstorms and terrible reality television in equal measure. She had a complicated relationship with her mother and no contact at all with her father, Naomi. In turn, began to see parts of Zion no one else ever noticed. That he was unexpectedly funny once he relaxed. Dry humor slipping out when he least expected it. That he had strong opinions about architecture and could spend an entire afternoon critiquing modern buildings with near-academic intensity. That he donated anonymously to dozens of causes and never spoke about it. That beneath his controlled exterior lived someone who felt deeply but had never been taught how to let those feelings breathe. Physical intimacy came slowly. Their second meeting ended with a brief hug outside a cafe. Naomi's arms light around him, Zion's body stiff with unfamiliarity. He didn't realize he was shaking until she stepped back and looked at him with quiet understanding. Their fifth meeting. She reached for his hand as they walked through a park, her fingers curling gently around his. The simplicity of the contact stunned him. He had closed billion-dollar deals with less intensity than that single, unguarded touch. The first time they kissed was during their 8th meeting in Naomi's small apartment. The space was modest and imperfect. Books stacked on the floor, plants clustered near the windows. Zion had been talking about a difficult decision at work, his voice tight with old habits of control. Naomi listened without interrupting, her attention complete. When he finished, she leaned forward and kissed him. It wasn't demanding. It wasn't rushed. Just a gentle press of her lips to his questioning, offering. Zion froze for a heartbeat, then slowly responded, his hands uncertain at his sides. The kiss lasted no more than 10 seconds, but when they pulled apart, everything he thought he understood about intimacy felt suddenly inadequate. Was that okay? Naomi asked softly. Yes, he said, his voice rough. More than okay. They took their time with everything after that. Zion discovered that he slept better at Naomi's apartment, which surprised them both. Her place was smaller, less pristine than his penthouse. But it felt lived in, real, safe. Naomi began staying over at his place on weekends. She brought plants, something he had never once considered owning. She cooked meals in his immaculate kitchen, filling the space with warmth, smells, and casual disorder. She laughed at how organized everything was, and gently teased him about his closet, but the world outside their careful bubble wasn't as forgiving. Zion's executive team noticed the changes quickly. He smiled more, left the office at reasonable hours, stopped sending emails in the middle of the night. When his CFO asked directly whether he was seeing someone, Zion didn't deny it. The information spread. It didn't take long for someone to connect Naomi to her profession. Questions followed. Then concerns. Then warnings. One investor threatened to pull funding, calling the relationship inappropriate and damaging to the company's image. Zion listened, expression neutral, but something inside him hardened. Naomi faced her own reckoning. Some former clients felt betrayed that she had entered an exclusive relationship. Others made crude assumptions about her intentions. Online spaces that once felt supportive turned sharp and judgmental. One evening, about 3 months into their relationship, Zion found Naomi sitting on his sofa, crying. Her former husband had reached out after seeing posts about her and Zion. The message was cruel, full of judgment. Predictions about how Zion would eventually discard her. Zion sat beside her, unsure at first how to comfort her. Physical closeness was still new territory. He doesn't know anything, Zion said carefully. About you. Or, about us. Naomi wiped her eyes roughly. He knows I was never enough for him. Maybe he's right. Maybe I won't be enough for you either. Everyone's been waiting for this to fail, she continued, voice breaking. They've been waiting for me to fail my whole life. Zion reached for her hand. The gesture still required intention, but it felt less foreign now. I don't care what they think, your investors care. They care about profit, he said firmly. And my company is performing better than ever, because I'm finally sleeping and thinking clearly. He squeezed her hand gently. This is the first decision I've made that wasn't about strategy or returns. It just feels right. Naomi looked at him, eyes red, searching. Does it? Terrifyingly right. That night, they made a decision together. They would stop hiding. Stopping the hiding changed everything. Zion made it clear to his board that his personal life was not a topic for debate or negotiation. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't justify himself. He simply stated it as fact, the same way he announced market shifts or long-term strategy. Some of them didn't like it. 2 investors pulled their funding within weeks, citing concerns about optics and judgment. 3 new ones stepped in almost immediately. His executive team adjusted once it became obvious this wasn't a phase or a lapse in discipline. Zion was calmer, more focused. The company was performing better than it had in years, not worse. Results spoke louder than rumors ever could. For Naomi, the shift was quieter, but no less profound. She didn't leave companionship work because Zion asked her to. He never did. The choice came from somewhere deeper. Being with him had altered something fundamental in her how she saw herself, what she wanted, what felt possible. She enrolled in classes toward a master's degree in counseling, wanting to return to helping people, but on terms that honored her boundaries and her worth. 6 months into their relationship, physical intimacy moved beyond hesitation. It happened on a rainy Saturday afternoon in Naomi's apartment. There was no plan, no expectation. They had been watching a movie, pressed close together on her small couch, rain streaking the windows in uneven lines. At some point, comfort shifted into something charged and quiet. "Is this okay?" Naomi asked, her hand resting lightly on his chest. Zion's heart was pounding so hard he was sure she could feel it. "Yes," he said, then added honestly, "but I don't know what I'm doing." "Neither do I," she replied. "Not with you." She sat up slightly. "We can stop any time." They didn't stop. What unfolded was careful, tender, occasionally awkward, and deeply meaningful. There was no performance, no script, just two people moving slowly, listening, learning. When it was over, Zion cried, overwhelmed by the vulnerability, by the closeness, by the realization that intimacy could feel like safety instead of threat. Naomi held him without hesitation. "Thank you," he whispered against her shoulder. "For what?" "For being patient. For seeing me." "Thank you for letting me," she answered softly. Over the next year, they built something neither of them had known before. A relationship grounded in honesty rather than performance. They argued, sometimes usually, when Zion retreated into old control patterns or when Naomi's fears about not being enough surfaced, but they didn't run. They talked. They stayed. Zion began therapy, something he once would have dismissed outright. With Naomi's quiet encouragement, he confronted the childhood neglect he had minimized for decades. He learned that his virginity had never been the real issue. Fear of abandonment had been. Fear of being seen and rejected. Fear of giving someone the power to hurt him. Naomi did her own work. She faced her habit of making herself smaller to keep relationships intact. The belief that her worth depended on what she provided. The shame she carried about her past and her choices. They didn't save each other. They didn't fix each other. They healed through consistency, through choosing to stay, through building trust, one honest conversation at a time. 2 years after that first night, Zion and Naomi stood on the balcony of his penthouse, the city lights stretching endlessly below them. It was nearly midnight, but sleep no longer haunted him. That problem had resolved itself the moment he learned how to let someone in. "Do you ever think about how we met?" Naomi asked, leaning into his shoulder. "Every day. Does it bother you?" "No," he said, wrapping an arm around her waist. "It's the bravest thing I've ever done." She tilted her head to look at him. "Asking for help, letting you stay." She smiled. "I love you," Naomi said. "I know we don't say it enough, but I do." The words still felt large in Zion's mouth, still carried a tremor of fear. But he was learning. "I love you too," he said, "even though it terrifies me." "Good," she replied softly. "It should." They stood there together in the quiet night. Two people who had found each other through unlikely circumstances and built something real from honest need. Zion slept easily now. His body finally understood it was safe. Naomi had stopped running from herself, finally believing she deserved tenderness. Below them, the city held millions of stories. This was theirs, imperfect, complicated, profoundly real. Zion hadn't hired a woman for one night. He had learned how to let someone stay, and that changed everything, even as their life together grew steadier. The outside world didn't soften its gaze. The more visible Zion and Naomi became, the louder the opinions grew. People who had never cared about either of them suddenly felt entitled to commentary. Articles hinted, industry whispers spread, assumptions were made in rooms they never entered. Zion heard it first through his board. Concerns were raised under the guise of professionalism. Questions framed as prudence. Someone suggested carefully, diplomatically, that the origins of his relationship reflected a lapse in judgment. That personal distractions could compromise leadership. That appearances mattered. Zion listened without interruption. When they finished, he folded his hands on the table and spoke calmly. My personal life is not up for discussion. My performance is. The silence that followed was sharp. Two investors followed through on their threats and withdrew their capital. For a moment, the loss stung not because of the money, but because it confirmed what he had always known. Conditional loyalty disappeared the moment he stopped conforming. But the fallout didn't become the catastrophe they predicted. Within weeks, 3 new investors stepped in. Ones who cared more about results than optics. The company didn't falter. It expanded. Zion's leadership sharpened further. Grounded now in rest and clarity instead of exhaustion and force. Naomi faced a different kind of reckoning. Some of her former clients reacted with quiet disappointment. Others with anger. A few with cruelty. She received messages questioning her motives, her integrity, her worth. Online spaces that once felt safe turned hostile. Judgment dressed up as moral concern. She absorbed it more quietly than Zion realized until one evening, when he found her curled on his couch, shoulders shaking. Her former husband had reached out. He had seen the photos. Read the speculation. And he had chosen cruelty. His message was filled with contempt, predictions of abandonment, reminders of every insecurity she had ever voiced during their marriage. He painted her as foolish, grasping, disposable. Zion sat beside her, uncertain at first how to respond. Comfort still didn't come naturally, but instinct took over. He placed a hand on her back, steady and present. He doesn't know you, Zion said carefully. He doesn't know us. Naomi wiped her face with the back of her hand. He knows I was never enough for him, and maybe he's right. Maybe I won't be enough for you either. The words hit Zion harder than any investor threat. Everyone's waiting for this to fail, she continued, voice cracking. They've been waiting my whole life. Waiting for me to prove them right. Zion turned toward her fully. He reached for her hand, this time without hesitation. I don't care what they think, your board does. My board cares about profit, he said firmly. And my company is stronger than it's ever been because I'm finally sleeping. Because I'm not hollow anymore. He tightened his grip slightly. This is the first choice I've ever made that wasn't strategic. I didn't calculate it. I didn't optimize it. I just listened to myself. Naomi searched his face. And what did you hear? That this matters, he said. That you matter. Silence settled, heavy but grounding. That night, they made a decision neither of them took lightly. They would stop hiding completely. No more careful distance. No more minimizing what they were to make others comfortable. Whatever came next, they would face it openly together. For Zion, it felt like crossing another threshold, one just as terrifying as that first night he'd let himself sleep beside someone else. But this time, he didn't hesitate because fear no longer felt like a warning. It felt like proof. Once they stopped hiding, life didn't suddenly become easier, but it became clearer. Zion addressed the situation directly, without defensiveness or apology. In meetings with his board, he made it unmistakably clear that his personal life was not a liability and would not be managed like one. He acknowledged the discomfort without validating it, standing firm in a way that surprised even himself. He had spent years negotiating, compromising, adjusting his edges to maintain control. This time, he did in single quotes. The company kept moving forward. Performance remained strong. Growth continued. The narrative some had hoped to spin that emotional attachment would weaken him never materialized. If anything, Zion was sharper now. Rested, present. The man who had once survived on discipline, alone, had learned something more sustainable. For Naomi, the shift was inward before it was public. She felt herself outgrowing the work she had once relied on, not with shame, but with clarity. Companionship had given her autonomy when she needed it. It had taught her boundaries, self-trust, choice. But now, the work no longer fit who she was becoming. She wanted to help people again, but without erasing herself in the process. So she made a decision that frightened her almost as much as loving Zion. She quit, not abruptly, not dramatically. She closed her accounts, said quiet goodbyes to clients who had mattered, and enrolled in classes toward a master's degree in counseling. It felt like stepping into a future she had once believed was no longer available to her. She studied, late into the night, surrounded by books and highlighters, her confidence wavering but persistent. Zion watched her with a mixture of pride and awe. 6 months into their relationship, something else shifted slowly, carefully, without pressure. It was a rainy Saturday afternoon in Naomi's apartment. The sky hung low and gray, rain tapping steadily against the windows. They sat pressed together on her small couch, a movie playing mostly unnoticed. At some point, comfort gave way to awareness. The air changed. Their closeness felt heavier, charged with possibility. Naomi rested her hand against his chest. "Is this okay?" Zion's heart pounded violently beneath her palm. "Yes," he said, then added, breathless and honest, "but I don't know what I'm doing." She smiled softly. "Neither do I, not with you." She shifted slightly, meeting his eyes. "We can stop any time." They didn't. What followed was tentative and tender, filled with pauses and reassurances, with laughter when things felt awkward and stillness when emotion overwhelmed them. There was no performance, no expectation, just attention, care. Choice. Afterward, Zion broke. Tears came without warning, raw and unstoppable. Years of restraint collapsed under the weight of connection. Naomi held him, steady and unafraid, letting him cry until there was nothing left to hold back. "Thank you," he whispered, voice shaking. "For what?" she asked, stroking his hair. "For being patient, for seeing me." "Thank you for letting me," she replied. From that point on, they began building something neither of them had ever known how to name before. A relationship rooted not in image or necessity, but in honesty. They argued, sometimes usually, when Zion retreated into old habits of control or when Naomi's fears about being enough resurfaced. But, instead of running, they stayed. They talked. They learned. Zion began therapy. What once would have felt like weakness, now felt like maintenance. He confronted the childhood neglect he had dismissed for decades, understanding at last that his virginity had never been the issue. The real fear had always been abandonment, being seen fully and rejected anyway. Naomi did her own work. She unlearned the instinct to shrink herself to be loved, faced the shame she had carried about her past, let go of the belief that her value was tied to what she could provide. They didn't rescue each other. They chose each other. Healing came not through grand gestures, but through consistency, through staying when it was uncomfortable, through trust built one honest conversation at a time. Time changed them in ways neither of them could have predicted. What they built together didn't feel dramatic from the inside. There were no sweeping declarations every day, no constant intensity. Instead, there was steadiness. Routine, the quiet accumulation of trust that came from choosing each other again and again, especially on the days when it would have been easier not to. They fought sometimes. Usually it happened when Zion slipped back into old patterns, when stress pushed him toward control, when he withdrew instead of speaking, when he tried to manage emotions the way he managed numbers. Naomi noticed it before he did. The distance, the tightening behind his eyes, and sometimes the tension came from her old insecurities resurfaced without warning. The fear that she was temporary, that she would eventually be replaced by someone easier, cleaner, more acceptable to the world Zion lived in. When that fear took hold, she grew quiet, guarded in ways that mirrored him. What made the difference was that they didn't disappear. They sat at the table and talked it through, even when the conversations were uncomfortable, even when Zion struggled to find the language for what he felt, even when Naomi had to admit she was afraid of asking for reassurance. Zion's therapy became a turning point. Week by week, he unpacked the childhood he had once dismissed as merely strict. He learned to name emotional neglect for what it was, learned that love withheld could shape a person just as deeply as love taken away. He began to understand that his virginity had never been about inexperience, it had been about fear. Fear of being fully seen. Fear of giving someone the power to leave. For the first time, he stopped treating his past as something to minimize. Naomi's work changed too. Classes stretched her in ways she hadn't expected. Counseling theory forced her to confront her own patterns, how often she had tied her worth to usefulness, how easily she disappeared inside other people's needs. Slowly, deliberately, she began to reclaim herself without apology. They learned each other's rhythms. Zion learned when Naomi needed reassurance and when she needed space. Naomi learned when Zion's silence meant overwhelm rather than distance. They developed a language made of glances, touches, pauses, things that couldn't be optimized or rushed. Physical intimacy deepened, not in frequency, but in meaning. It became less about discovery and more about connection. Less tentative, more trusting. Zion no longer froze when closeness arrived. Naomi no longer questioned whether she was allowed to want it. One quiet evening, nearly 2 years after the night they first lay down together, they stood on the balcony of Zion's penthouse. The city stretched below them, alive with light and motion. It was close to midnight, but Zion felt no familiar anxiety. Sleep no longer felt like something he had to fight for. "Do you ever think about how we met?" Naomi asked, resting her head against his shoulder. "Every day," he said honestly. "Does it ever bother you?" "No." He wrapped an arm around her waist, grounding himself in the reality of her. "It's the bravest thing I've ever done." She tilted her face up toward his, admitting, "You needed help." "Letting you see me," he corrected. "Letting you stay?" Naomi smiled, her eyes soft. "I love you. I know we don't say it enough, but I do." The words still scared him. They always would, a little. But fear no longer stopped him. "I love you too," Zion said. "Even when it terrifies me." She laughed quietly. "Good, it should." They stood together in the night, the noise of the city rising and falling beneath them. Two people who had met through unlikely circumstances and chosen to turn honesty into something lasting. Zion slept easily now. His body finally understood it was safe. Naomi no longer ran from herself. She believed, at last, that tenderness wasn't something she had to earn. Below them were millions of stories. This one was theirs, imperfect, complicated, and undeniably real. The city below them kept moving. Unaware of the quiet conclusion unfolding above it, Zion stood with Naomi on the balcony. Her body warm against his, the night air soft and familiar now. Once, midnight had been a threat, a reminder of another sleepless battle waiting to begin. Now it was just another hour passing, another moment shared. His body no longer braced itself against the dark, it welcomed it. He thought, not for the first time, about that first night. About how desperate and afraid he had been. About how close he'd come to closing the laptop, to choosing the familiar misery of control over the terror of vulnerability. He understood now how easily his life could have remained exactly as it was, successful, respected, and unbearably empty. Naomi shifted slightly, turning to face him. The city lights reflected softly in her eyes. "You're thinking again," she said, not accusing, just noticing. "I was," he admitted, "about how different everything could have been, but isn't," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He wrapped his arm around her waist, pulling her closer. The gesture no longer felt tentative or practiced. It felt like home. For a long time, Zion had believed love was transactional, something earned, measured, revoked. He had believed safety came from distance. That rest was a luxury reserved for people who weren't constantly on guard. Naomi had undone those beliefs, not by arguing with them, but by staying, by showing up, by choosing him, even when it would have been easier not to. Naomi, in her own way, had stopped running to utter. She no longer shaped herself around what she thought others needed. She no longer apologized for wanting tenderness, stability, depth. With Zion, she had learned that love didn't require disappearance. It asked for presence. They went inside together, the balcony doors closing softly behind them. The penthouse no longer felt like a fortress. It felt lived in, changed, shared. Plants lined the windows now. Books sat on tables where silence used to dominate. Evidence of a life that had expanded instead of contracted. Later, when they lay down together, sleep came easily to Zion. No rituals, no effort, just rest. His body trusted the quiet. In the darkness, Naomi listened to his breathing, slow, even, and unguarded. She smiled faintly to herself, not with surprise anymore, but with gratitude. This peace no longer felt fragile. It had been earned. Zion Holt had not hired a woman for one night. He had learned how to ask for help. He had learned how to be seen. He had learned how to let someone stay, and that had made all the difference.